This piece of Lisa is being brought to you by Mutual Security Credit Union. Find out more at mscu.com.
Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer-animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next, and I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorene and I have a wonderful family together.
We pay tribute to Steve Jobs, who left this world at the very premature age of 56. And I want to introduce you to Daniel Sieberg. He wrote a letter called Dear Steve, a letter to the departed genius, which caught my eye and caught my attention. He is an ABC News tech contributor, author of the book, The Digital Diet, the 4-step plan to break your tech addiction and regain balance in your life. Well, that's not a problem for me because, as you know, I'm really not addicted to tech at all, although I do like to read my emails. Daniel, welcome to the Lisa Wexler Show.
Lisa, it's great to be with you.
Maybe I'm a little addicted, Dan, because I do read my emails even compulsively sometimes in the middle of the night.
Well, there are varying levels of addiction. Usually I measure it by whatever your spouse or your partner is telling you is a problem, then you know you need to do something about it.
Well, my partner tells me my problem is I never carry my phone with me. So
you have the opposite problem.
I have the opposite problem, that's right. I have the absent-minded problem. Well, you write, Dear Steve, a letter to the departed genius. So talk to me about what influence Steve Jobs had in your life.
Well, you know, I was, initiated with Apple computers from a very young age. From the time that I can remember being in grade school, I had an Apple II Plus or an Apple IIe computer. It was the first chance that I got to explore this, at the time, very rudimentary world. We're talking about back during the mid-'80s.
I was going to say, are you in your early 40s?
I'm in just about 40.
Yeah, okay.
So it was, it was right at the beginning of putting computers in classrooms. And, they were text-based. They were, of course, by today's standards, they were, extremely basic. But it brought the idea of a personal computer to people. And that was the beginning of a totally different way of thinking about technology, how you interacted with it. And as we know now, it was just the beginning.
Yeah, it really was just the beginning. Wasn't it very brilliant of Steve Jobs to give those Apple computers to the schools?
It was, and he continued that, especially now we're talking about iPads being in schools, and he really pushed for them to become part of the education system, and that's, I think, paying some dividends. It's a technology that children understand very quickly. I have a 10-month-old daughter, and when she sees an iPad, she gets it. I try to keep it away from her most of the time. But
yeah, you should, actually.
Yeah, but kids at the age when they should be exploring computers, something like the iPad can be a great tool for them.
Well, one of the things that Steve Jobs said that really I took away from, I heard it quoted, I don't know that we have it queued up today. It was from his very famous commencement speech at Stanford, and he said, "You will know your life only by looking back at your life," something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but it was the idea that you couldn't know how your life made sense walking towards it only by looking back at it. And I thought that was really an extraordinary thing to say, but it's really true. It's probably how we best connect the dots. So looking back at Steve Jobs' life from the point of view of a tech reporter, What are some of the obstacles, the true challenges that this man overcame? Because it's so easy now to look at it from the end point and say, oh, it looks so easy. Look at all the success. But he was known as much for his failures.
Absolutely. And, he really did become an American success story because of the failures and the hurdles that he overcame. And, I don't know that a lot of people understand that he was a child of adoption, so he grew up, with his own set of sort of personal hurdles to overcome.
Well, there are abandonment issues in every adopted child, period, and they are very real, and they don't really go away.
Exactly. And I think that, when he started Apple, which, he really did start it in a garage. That sounds like a cliche these days, but he and Steve Wozniak started this company in 1976. Nobody gave them a chance. Nobody thought that what they had in mind was ever going to catch on. They faced no continuously, and finally got a little bit of funding, finally got some attention of some bigger companies, and, pushed out these personal computers. That gave them some momentum for a while, but then, as we heard as part of his commencement speech, he was ultimately fired from the company that he created. He was ousted.
Why was he ousted?
Well, it was because they thought he was too young. He was 30 years old at the time. The new CEO that came in had come over from Pepsi, I believe, and he really felt like he needed to take the reins, that Steve Jobs was just too brash, wasn't thinking like a manager, was too focused on sort of the product side and not the operations side. And he got pushed out the door. And as we've seen now, we look back and we can say, well, that looked like a dumb thing to do, because Steve Jobs eventually came back to the company and brought this resurgence that nobody had expected. It's easy to forget Apple was left for dead back in the late 1990s. It was it becoming totally obsolete and not relevant at all in the tech space.
Well, what I wanted to ask you about this was, so John Sculley was the guy who's credited with throwing him out. How did John Sculley's career fare after that happened?
Well, it didn't go so well at Apple, because the company started to take a bit of a nosedive. Folks started to miss Steve Jobs. And, he still had a little bit of a successful career, and I think that ultimately he looked back and realized that maybe that wasn't such a good idea after all, and I think grew to respect what Steve Jobs ended up accomplishing.
And how is it that Steve Jobs came back to the company? Did he ask to come back, or did they ask for him?
It was probably a little bit of both, but he founded this company called Next Computers, which, he kind of wanted to branch out on his own. And Apple, as a lot of technology companies do, make acquisitions of smaller companies, thinking that maybe they can get something from them. And this just happened to be a company started by Steve Jobs. And once he was back into the fold, back into the mix at Apple, they realized that maybe he needs a bigger role, a bigger platform, get him back doing something more significant. And they needed to fill a void. I mean, Apple was in a free fall, and they needed the kind of leadership that Steve Jobs brought to the table. As much as it has been criticized over the years, too, there are legendary stories of him yelling at people in meetings, firing people without due reason. You never wanted to run into Steve Jobs in an elevator because he'd expect you to say something interesting. There are lots of stories about that.
Oh, my God, the pressure. The pressure. You couldn't just talk about the weather, huh? You have to talk about your latest, new reincarnation of the mouse, calling it, I don't know, something like the rat or something like that.
You had to wow him. It was like the ultimate elevator pitch.
Okay.
And, so he brought all of that to the table and really emphasized design and style and the way that people feel and connect with their technology. It was almost like he was trying to bring technology to people's soul, which at the time, when you think about what computers were and laptops, they're very boxy and plastic and not really that interesting. They became, thanks to Apple, objects of desire. You would see an iPod in the early days in 2001, or eventually an iPhone, and you just kind of wanted to touch it and play with it and see what it was about. And people really didn't think of technology like that prior to Steve Jobs. Now, this isn't to say that every idea for Apple burst out of Steve Jobs' head, in the shower one day. I mean, he had a lot of talented people with him, but he managed to synthesize all of those minds and all of those ideas and bring them to bear, which says a lot about his energy and enthusiasm.
In the Stanford commencement speech, which was in June of 2005, he said that death clears out the old to make way for the new, and he thought that death was one of the best inventions that was ever made.
Yeah, the death is life's change agent.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's funny, that commencement speech has been around on the web for many years, and I've spoken to the folks at Stanford, and, they're very, it's a very emotional sort of look at Steve Jobs, and more people are getting a look at it now that he's passed away. But it's a very unique chance to see him speak emotionally and from the heart, to see him vulnerable, knowing that he's been diagnosed with his cancer at the time, hoping that he's past it. But he speaks very frankly about what mortality means, to inspiration, to fighting through something, to doing what you want to do with your life. And it's very motivational. And
it is. He basically had no time to lose, and he made the most of the time he had left.
Exactly. And I think that's a message that can carry over to lots of different fields, obviously. And I think that's what a lot of the tech crowd took from him. That's why there are so many Apple fans. They saw him overcome these things, including cancer to a certain degree.
Yes. 7 years with pancreatic cancer has to be some kind of record.
Exactly. And I think that kind of message just speaks to people on a level that's undeniable, and will be missed.
Dan, tell me a little bit about his personal life. Although you were a tech reporter, I mean, we all are interested in the personal side of things. Yeah, he did have a paternity suit against him a long time ago. Whatever happened with that?
I'm not actually honestly sure what happened with that, but I do know that he's very, very closed off in a personal way. I mean, you would not see him and his wife Lorraine very often. You certainly wouldn't see their children. He was not about parading them around or seeking the spotlight in that way. He tried to distance his personal life from his professional life. And, he didn't seek to, I think, become a celebrity. He wasn't trying to, elevate himself in a way that some people have accused him of, trying to be godlike in some way. But I think that he's just so personally so caught up in all of this stuff. That's all he knows. I think that he's described these days as a visionary and a genius, but I think he's also obsessed.
Yeah.
I've heard stories about him calling up somebody in the middle of the night and saying, "Can we change this color? Just by a little shade here."
Sure.
Because he just can't stop thinking about this stuff. So I wonder how his family dealt with all of those things. I don't know firsthand. But, I get you can't help but look at the way that he was and how passionate he was, and spent probably a lot of time at the office, and wonder how those relationships were. I think it may have been one of those things he grappled with because he was so passionate about it.
Well, one of the other interesting aspects of his character was that after he resumed control of Apple, he eliminated all corporate philanthropy programs. Now, one of the things Bill Gates has tried to be known for is giving money away. And I don't think that was on Steve Jobs' radar, at least not publicly. It may have been true privately, but not publicly.
Well, it's interesting, and he does get criticized for not stepping up perhaps with a certain cause or being more vocal about something. And, Bill Gates does that now. That's a lot of his work was done in his later years at Microsoft, and since he sort of stepped back from working there full time. But, and so people will say, well, Steve Jobs, he had all this money and influence. Why not use it for more sort of greater good? And I think that he was doing it on a level that was perhaps more subtle. He was trying to sort of change the world through technology in a way that wasn't quite as obvious. And, in a sense that he has, in the way that we...
Oh, hugely. And in fact, I think there's a lot of essays today that speak to the social media revolution as not having been possible without the technology of Steve Jobs.
Absolutely. And you think of devices these days that people use in other parts of the world, too, that have been influenced by Apple and the design. And, we were hearing about this tablet device in India that's going for, $35, $45. Great and wonderfully affordable for people who may have some need for it. And that may not have been possible without something like the iPad, which got people thinking about how can this be used.
Right.
And so, I can certainly understand how, not everybody was a fan of Steve Jobs. It's not everybody's an Apple person, and I understand that. I mean, I don't have any Apple stock. The company's performance is not what I'm concerned about. It's more about his vision.
You mean you're not buying TechCrunch or anything like that, Dan? That's an inside joke for you who are listening. The writer for TechCrunch, and I don't even remember his name, wrote this very influential blog and then proceeds to have absolutely no problem, no compunction about investing in the companies that he touts. I thought that...
Yeah, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, that certainly is, Dan.
But I have no tech investments whatsoever. But I think that gives me a clarity of thinking with this that I think is necessary.
certain kind of independent ethical credentials. I would agree with that. Dan Sieberg, I invite you to come back on the show, and then you can educate me about all these tech things that I know nothing about. How's that?
I learned from you.
I don't think so. But thank you so much for being on the show.
It was my pleasure.
You've just been listening to A Piece of Lisa. If you'd like to listen to the whole 2-hour show, please go to lisawexler.com, where all shows are archived. And do follow me on Twitter @Lisa Wexler. Thanks for listening.